The story is that the CIA became fascinated with the idea of mind control for reasons we can get into, and it decided to launch a program to try to find out how do you take control of a person's mind and soul and body. They figured, and I think they were right in this, that if you could answer that, if you could find the answer to that, then the prize would be nothing less than global mastery. You could make everybody in the world do what you wanted. And in addition, they were culturally conditioned, I think, by all those movies and all those books and all those stories about people dropping a pill in somebody's drink or shaking a watch in front of your eyes. And the next thing you know, you can make people do what they want. So they launched a program to try to find the secrets of mind control.
What was the stated mission of the CIA at its start?
The CIA is the first peacetime intelligence agency that the United States has ever had. So during the Second World War, there was an intelligence agency, the Office of Strategic Services, and to the shock of many of its agents, President Truman, at the end of the war, abolished it. 2 years later, as the world was changing, Truman also changed. He decided that actually the United States should have an intelligence agency. And so he signed off on something called the National Security Act in 1947, which did a number of things. It created the Department of Defense and it created the National Security Council, but it also created the CIA. And it gave the CIA a remarkable amount of latitude. Actually, Allen Dulles, who came to be the dominant figure in the early CIA, helped write the bill that created the CIA. And it gave a few specific assignments that the CIA could carry out. And then it said, and such other assignments as the president or the National Security Council shall from time to time ask it to perform. So that was a loophole big enough to drive a truck through. And then in future National Security Council decision directives, the CIA was given more specific powers to carry out covert action abroad. And it became one of the determining, shaping factors of American foreign policy. This was particularly true during the 1950s due to a unique circumstance in American history. You had two siblings, brothers, running the overt and the covert sides of American foreign policy. So you had John Foster Dulles as the Secretary of State being the public face of American diplomacy and American engagement with the world. And his brother, Allen, was doing everything that you couldn't see. So they were working together a little bit like I've read that snake jaws, they can open their mouths really wide because their jaws are not connected at the back. It was something like that. The two Dulles brothers were like the upper and lower jaws of some snake, and they would fix on a country that was defying the United States, and with the power of diplomacy and the power of covert action, wreak havoc wherever they wished.
Yeah, and to the idea of havoc within the CIA, you've written an excellent book about Sidney Gottlieb and Project MKUltra. What was the mission of Project MKUltra?
I have to tell you, this is my 10th book.
Mm-hmm.
Many of my books have revealed information that shocked a lot of people and surprised me. But this is the first time I have been shocked. I have to say, I still have trouble wrapping my mind around the fact that there was such a project as MKUltra and such a person as Sidney Gottlieb. So the story is that the CIA became fascinated with the idea of mind control for reasons we can get into, and it decided to launch a program to try to find out how do you take control of a person's mind and soul and body. They figured, and I think they were right in this, that if you could answer that, if you could find the answer to that, then the prize would be nothing less than global mastery. You could make everybody in the world do what you wanted. And in addition, they were culturally conditioned, I think, by all those movies and all those books and all those stories about people dropping a pill in somebody's drink or shaking a watch in front of your eyes. And the next thing you know, you can make people do what they want. So they launched a program to try to find the secrets of mind control. And they found this amazing figure who I think I've recovered from total anonymity. Sidney Gottlieb was probably the most powerful unknown American of the 20th century. He had what amounted to a license to kill issued by the US government. He could go off to a foreign country, have the CIA or the military police give him human beings, people who had been prisoners or refugees they had caught or suspected enemy agents, and he could experiment on them and, in some cases, experiment them to death. The reason these experiments were so brutal was that Gottlieb had decided with his scientific approach that before you could find a way to implant a new mind into someone's brain, you first had to find a way to blast away the mind that was in there. And the stories of what he did in that pursuit are what makes up that book, Poisoner in Chief, and what were chilling even to me as I was writing it.
Me too. Yeah. And we'll have to get into some of the specifics. One thing I wonder about in reading it is, Gottlieb is this figure who gets brought into this organization, but he seems very much an outsider. What made him the man for the job?
You're absolutely right. So in the early CIA, most of the senior officers were from the same social class. They were silver spoon aristocrats from the Northeast. They had gone to Ivy League schools in most cases. Many of them gone to the same prep schools and dated the same girls and played golf in the same golf clubs and were in the same yacht clubs and later went to work for the same law firms and Wall Street brokerage houses. So there was a very monochromatic group. But Sidney Gottlieb was completely different. He was a Jew. His parents were immigrants from Central Europe. He went to City College of New York. He stuttered. He had a limp. He was completely different from these other CIA officials. And I think there was a reason for that. The higher ranking officials at the CIA understood that a project like this was going to require a lot of what in the intelligence business is called wet work. It means killing people and making people bloody. This is a little bit unpleasant for people of a certain social class, but also there's another problem. You never know when something like this might go terribly wrong, and somebody might have to be blamed for it. You wouldn't want it to be somebody from inside your own group because that's too intimate a tie. So I think one of the reasons they liked bringing Gottlieb in was they thought that if someday they have to throw someone under the bus, they wouldn't mind throwing him. And actually, that's exactly what happened because decades later, when Gottlieb was dragged before a congressional committee in a false name, he complained about documents that had been released about MK Ultra in which all the signatures were blacked out except for his. And he was exactly right. They wanted to pin the blame on someone, and they had hired him, I think, in part because they thought that if they needed to blame someone, they'd be happy to blame him.
Yeah, it's amazing to me because something that I talk with people a lot about on this show is how we get manipulated. And it seems that Gottlieb was sort of a target. And of course, he did terrible things, which we'll get into. And yet it seems he was sort of picked on. I don't know, what do you make of that? Can we say that he was a patsy, that he was manipulated, that he was guilt tripped with patriotism?
I wouldn't say that he was dragged into this against his will. And I think there's
Hmm.
some serious allegations you can make against Gottlieb. So, uh, Gottlieb, because of his limp, was not able to serve in World War II, and this affected him.
Hmm.
So he was looking for a way to compensate for that. The CIA came to him. He was a chemist, he had worked in several other government agencies, a young, ambitious guy. So he was happy to come into the CIA. And indeed, the CIA was very appealing to that whole generation of people in the immediate post-war era who saw a new war. That was the conflict with the Soviet Union, and Gottlieb wanted to do his part. Now, in his career at the CIA, Gottlieb did a number of things. Um, he compounded all the poisons, for example, that were used to try to kill Fidel Castro and to kill Patrice Lumumba, and all the poison pills that were given to American spies and to commandos that we sent into other countries. He made all those poison pills. But you could probably argue that in that job, he was more or less just a pharmacist, and somebody else could have done it too. Later on in life, he was in charge of creating all of the devices and the toys that CIA officers and other undercover agents use, like Q in the James Bond movies. That was Gottlieb. But again, in that job, he was doing something that another person probably could have done more or less as well. But running MK Ultra was different. He had full authority to design it. MK Ultra came completely out of his mind. His superiors knew that it was ugly, and that's the reason they didn't really want any reports from him. So another person might have designed MK Ultra in a way that wasn't so brutal and that wasn't so horrific, and it didn't ruin so many lives. Now, I'm I'm sure that if we could question Gottlieb today and ask him why he felt he had this power or this drive to kill people in the course of his CIA research, I think he would tell us that you had to look at the tenor of the times.
Mhm.
We were told that the Soviets were about to launch a devastating attack on the United States that would not only destroy our country, but end the possibility of any meaningful human life on Earth. If the stakes are that high, a few lives and or even a few hundred lives would be a small price to pay. So I think you have to put it back in that context. Nonetheless, even though I'm a person who doesn't like to judge historical characters by the standards of today, I think you can say that the brutality of MK Ultra came in a certain degree from Gottlieb. Now, we'll talk later. Gottlieb was a real LSD maven, the first one in America. He said he took LSD more than 200 times. I'm wondering sometimes if he came up with some of these bizarre experiments and these crazy combinations of tortures while he was tripping on acid, or was he even doing that while he was observing those tortures? Um, he raises all sorts of questions and is an absolutely fascinating figure. But what makes him so fascinating is not that he just did what I just described, but it's that at the same time he was this kind of proto hippie. He was in the 1950s, not living in any ticky-tacky development. He had a kind of an eco home way out in the Virginia woods. He grew his own vegetables. He meditated. He wrote poetry. He got up before dawn to feed the goats. He ate organically. Nobody did this in the 1950s. He was a community spirited person. So you have to wonder, how do you fit these two pieces together? Sometimes when I was writing this book, Poisoner in Chief, I imagined that when he would go over one of the bridges over the Potomac to go home, it would be something like a snake leaving the skin behind, that he would kind of transform his identity into this contemplative, gentle father figure and quasi mystic. And then coming back the other way the next morning, he would take on the guise that he had as the most prolific American torturer of his generation.
Yeah, the contrast is remarkable. And there are so many details in your book too. I mean, he's a family man, and then sometimes he's going on these wild trips to San Francisco where the CIA is running a brothel, and the guy who runs the brothel, Gottlieb, is having sex with that guy's wife while that guy is drunk. The whole thing is just it's amazing to think that this was all done on a government budget.
Really, when you're trying to think of the craziest projects that the US could have come up with in the name of national
Yeah.
security, It's hard to think of one that goes wilder than MK Ultra. The piece to which you're referring, which was called Operation Midnight Climax, was the bordello in San Francisco that they set up to monitor what would happen to people when they were given LSD or other drugs in their drinks. So girls would bring men back to this apartment, and some drunken drug agent who had no knowledge of psychology or sexuality or anything would sit behind a one-way mirror on a portable toilet drinking cocktails out of a pitcher and watching, and then trying to think about whether it's true that men talk more freely after sex when they have LSD. So and as you said, this project gave Gottlieb the fringe benefit of being able to go to San Francisco whenever he wanted and take advantage of the brothel's services, which may have been the whole reason the brothel was established in the first place. It's a business expense. So the reach of this project is really amazing. I can say that I think that although my book is certainly the most complete account of MK Ultra, I'm painfully aware that I've only discovered a very small
Mm,
portion of what MK Ultra was and what Sidney Gottlieb did. Um, at the end of his CIA career, he and the CIA director agreed that he should destroy all the records of MK Ultra. That was done over the objections of the CIA archivist because it's a federal crime, the destruction of U.S. government property. However, it's not nearly as serious a crime as the crimes that would have been revealed in those documents. So, Poisoner in Chief, I think, is the best effort to try to get the outlines of MK Ultra, but there's a lot there that we'll probably never know.
yeah. So with all this energy and talent and money around the topic of mind control, what was happening that made mind control that hot topic?
I think you have to divide this into two pieces. One is the one I already mentioned, that there was a whole generation or two of cultural conditioning, stories of Sherlock Holmes and everybody else that hypnotized people, and a lot of movies like that. So I think they were early. That generation of people grew up thinking that what cinematographers and short story writers and novelists could come up with could be made real, which is not really a good thing to start assuming. But then there was something else happened, and that was a couple of actual historical events that the CIA misinterpreted to mean that the Soviets or the communists had already made great advances towards mind control. So there were two things that happened. Uh, First of all, the Roman Catholic Cardinal of Hungary was arrested, Cardinal Mindszenty. And after a number of months, he was put on trial and confessed to crimes he obviously had not committed. And so it was clear it was just a show trial and that he was being coerced. But what really interested the CIA was the way that he spoke and the look on his face. They thought that he was being controlled somehow from behind by another operator, and that somebody else was speaking through him. Now, this wasn't true. The fact is that he was coerced by normal methods that have been used ever since the beginning of torture. But the CIA interpreted that as meaning that he was under some kind of mind control. And then came Korea, after which some American prisoners were released and said that they had participated in war crimes in Korea and criticized life in the United States. The Americans then concluded they have to have been brainwashed. So these two episodes led the CIA to believe that there was an urgency to this project because the Soviets were already on it. So you have these two factors, the background of cultural conditioning, then these episodes of the CIA concluding that the project is already well underway in communist circles. That's what made them think we have to do it. We have to do it first. And whatever the human cost would be, we're willing to pay
Hmm.
because the stakes are so high. And that's why Gottlieb was allowed to carry out these really most in extreme and intense experiments on human beings that have ever been conducted by any officer of the United States government.
Yeah. So help us sort this out. There does seem to be, and you mentioned like conventional methods of brainwashing, so to speak, and that cardinal. I have a book here that I've read and talking with people about cults, the work of Robert J. Lifton about thought reform and that sort of thing. Would you say that that is sort of standard? You bring people into some sort of prison environment, they're heavily interrogated, they're eventually tortured and pushed to make a wild confession. Is that the distinction between that and some sort of behind the head mind control?
Absolutely. Those are two different things because what you
Okay.
just described is what actually happened to that Cardinal
Hmm.
Vincenti.
Yeah.
He was kept in isolation. They gave him repeated questioning over and over, not allowed to sleep. These are very old coercive methods. But somehow the CIA couldn't believe that.
Huh.
He was tortured by just the same means that people have been using since forever. But the CIA was in this mindset. And so I think they misinterpreted that and it sent them into a panic. And that's what made them think we have to have a program that's going to be no holds barred.
Yeah, and that does get more to the stuff of movies. You know, that idea that you could trigger a person into saying something rather than just slowly breaking them down over time. I wonder another Gottlieb contradiction is, correct me if I'm wrong, he was of European Jewish descent, and he was through Project MK Ultra hiring Nazi doctors.
So you're right. Yeah, he was Jewish. The parents were Orthodox Jews who came from what's now Hungary.
Hmm.
Um, and he went to Hebrew school, had a bar mitzvah, uh, grew up in the Bronx. Now, when he launched MK Ultra, as I said, his first scientific conclusion was that we need to find a way to destroy a human mind before we can find a way to put a new one in. Then the next scientific question he asked himself, also what any scholar would do, was what material, what work has already been done in this field? Who's out there that knows the techniques of destroying a human mind and destroying a human body and torturing people so they lose all consciousness? Well, the people that know the best are the Nazi doctors from the concentration camps. The fact is, the United States doesn't know all those things because we never conducted those kinds of experiments. But the Nazis had done that, and so had their Japanese counterparts. So Gottlieb went to those Nazis. And we have records of some meetings, for example, uh, between ex-concentration camp doctors and people at the CIA. In one case, two of these Nazi concentration camp experts came actually to Washington to give a lecture at the CIA, and they were talking about the use of different poisons. For example, the Americans had no way of knowing the answer to this question. Does the amount of sarin gas that it takes to kill a baby, is that the same as the amount it takes to kill an adult, or are there different doses? Well, these guys knew all those things because they conducted all those experiments. So while I was researching my book, Poisoner in Chief, I went out to what I think is the very first CIA secret prison or black site. It's a beautiful chateau in the German countryside outside of Frankfurt. Of course, the Americans could operate completely freely after the Second World War in Germany because we were the occupying power. There was no other law. So at this villa, I found it. I went there, and I found a young German businessman who was had bought the building, and he was cutting it up into condos, and he brought me in, and he took me into the basement where he has some large storerooms, and he said, "These are the rooms where the CIA doctors carried out experiments, which were actually only continuations of the experiments that those doctors had been conducting just down the road in concentration camps during the Second World War. Now they were working for the United States." So Gottlieb, as you point out, was a refugee from Europe who would almost undoubtedly have been swept up in the Holocaust if his parents had not emigrated. In fact, he might even have wound up being the victims of one of those concentration camp
Wow.
so-called experiments. But as it happened, he was happy to work side by side with the Nazi doctors who carried out those experiments. So it might have been uncomfortable for him. We don't know, but I guess he would have justified it by saying, this is the new war. And in fact, let's face it, there were other areas of the U.S. security policy in which we happily hired Nazis. Our whole space program and the intercontinental ballistic missile program was run by German scientists who made the missiles that rained down on London and many cities in Europe. Then the U.S. security service that was trying to penetrate Russia, the Soviet Union, and Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe was entirely run by Nazis, ex-Nazis, because they were the only ones that had agents in those countries. The Soviet Union was our ally during the Second World War. So we didn't have any spies there. So what did we do? We hired the only people that had spies there. That was the ex-Nazis. So when it came Gottlieb's turn, and he wanted to hire Nazi ex-concentration camp doctors, he could say, well, there's already a precedent. You already hired all the aerodynamic engineers, and then you hired the spies. So why shouldn't I be able to hire some of those experimenters?
Yeah. So I can see how he could justify it to others. And yet it seems that MK Ultra has so much of Gottlieb's fingerprint on it. How can it be that he didn't have a personal problem that would stop this? I mean, you're his biographer, so you've kind of been in his head for a while. I mean, what do you think?
You're asking a very difficult question. You're right. As a biographer, you live with the person. And I
Yeah.
lived with him in this little room that I'm sitting in right now. And it was very uncomfortable because I
Yeah.
had to read about all the things that he did. It was a very disconcerting year plus that I had to live with that guy. Um, Now, my research, however, I was handicapped among many other handicaps that I had by an interesting fact that sealed off a lot of his family history. Um, Gottlieb had four children, now adults, and one of them is more or less prominent, and he became a state archivist in Wisconsin and had written a book about labor history. So I wanted to contact him and ask him. It would be the logical thing that a biographer would do. So I contacted him and I didn't hear back. So then I started doing everything else. I Facebooked him, and I even sent him registered mail and FedEx, and I tried to track down different email addresses. And finally, I decided to do something that I've sometimes had to do in my days as a New York Times reporter, which is just doorstop the guy. You just go to his house and you just wait for him to come out. So I was ready to do that and go off to Wisconsin and see if I could find him because it seemed like I wasn't reaching him for some reason. Then I happened to come across a person who was very close to the family. And I told her my sad story. And she said, oh, there's a reason for that. She said, after Gottlieb died, his widow, their mother, called the four together, the four children, and made them promise that they would never speak about their father to anyone. And they have maintained that silence. Now, I've heard that some of them were very angry about him and that never wanted to hear his name anymore or that they were estranged from him. But what was going on inside his head? I wonder if even the kids knew about that. They certainly had some understanding of what he was doing. I did find an ex-girlfriend of one of the sons who told me that the son would say to her, "My father kills people. My father," and then and showed him a hidden cabinet with a lot of guns in his house, which she told me I later thought when I learned more about who he was, he might have been keeping in case somebody came to get him as a revenge for some of the things that he had done.
As the project goes on, it seems that he's sort of hitting his stride in his creativity and in this wacky Jekyll and Hyde kind of way. He gets into projects with things like magic and working with high-level magicians too. What was that about?
There was no limit to Gottlieb's imagination, which might be one of the reasons that he was such a good choice for the CIA. Yeah, he did hire a famous magician of that era, And the reason he wanted to hire this guy was because Gottlieb was concocting all sorts of poisons and various mind-controlled drugs, and he would put these into pills. I mean, he was doing everything. He was going to Alaska and harvesting Alaskan butter clams to extract their toxins and getting the inner organs of reptiles from Africa and Latin America. Uh, so he would make these pills that he thought he wanted to try or he thought would have an effect, but you have to be able to deliver the pill. How are you going to get how do you drop the pill in the drink without anybody noticing? So he hired this magician who did a stage show, and he had this guy try to teach CIA operatives how do you distract people's attention? How do you hold things? Where would you hide them? So it was like sleight of hand. And when I was researching that piece of the story, I discovered that it's he would give it in his lecture to the CIA officers. He would tell them it's you've often read that the uh, the hand is quicker than the eye. That's how magic works. But this is not correct. Actually, the hand is not quicker than the eye. Magic works another way, which is by distraction. You make people look somewhere and you do something else. So that was the piece, that was the magic piece. And it was just as crazy as him becoming the big LSD maven. I mean, he was the first American to become fascinated with LSD. And in 1953, he persuaded the CIA to buy the entire world supply of LSD, which it did. And Gottlieb then spread it around. And actually, it might have been his greatest legacy when you think about it. So he used some of that LSD in very brutal experiments. I found one where he got 7 African American prisoners locked in a cell and fed them what were described as triple and quadruple doses of LSD every day for 77 days in an effort to find out if that would destroy their minds. Now, we don't have the protocols, but I can guess that, yeah, it probably did. And I used to wonder when I was reading about these things and writing about them, what happened to those 7 guys? Did they ever know what happened to them? Did they survive? That was just collateral damage of MK Ultra. However, Gottlieb also wanted to know how ordinary people would respond to LSD in a clinical setting, knowing full well what they were getting. Now, since the CIA doesn't have medical facilities, Gottlieb set up a couple of bogus medical foundations with appropriate stationery. And he sent out letters to hospitals and VA clinics and university hospitals all around the country saying, our medical foundation is interested in researching this new psychoactive drug, LSD. And so we'd like to hire your clinic or your hospital. And what we'll do is we'll send you the LSD. We pay you. You put ads in some local newspaper, tell people exactly what it is. You'll be coming in to try a new psychoactive drug. You pay them with money that we will provide, and you write up the reports and send them to us. And we pay you for this. So almost overnight, a whole market grew up of hospitals that wanted to try this. They didn't realize it was the CIA. They thought it was this medical foundation. So who were among the first people that responded to those ads? Well, one of them was Allen Ginsberg, the poet, who, of course, went on to become one of the high priests of LSD. He did it in California. He went into a hospital and he listened to Richard Wagner opera on his headphones while he was taking his very first LSD trip. The author of that great novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that was another guy, Ken Kesey. He also got his first LSD. As a volunteer in one of these experiments. And when I was researching Poisoner in Chief, I even found an interview with him in which he said, yes, I did get the ideas and the stories for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest from working in this mental hospital, but that's not the reason that I got the job. I got the job because I wanted to steal the LSD out of the pharmacy, which I did and brought it to all my friends. Another one of the very first guys that volunteered for those experiments was Robert Hunter, the lyricist for the Grateful Dead. He brought it home to the rest of the Grateful Dead. So, and then it spread from there. So actually, it's through these clinical experiments that LSD leaked out of the CIA's control into the mainstream. And the irony, of course, is that the drug that the CIA hoped would give it the power to control the world wound up fueling a generational rebellion, which was aimed at destroying everything the CIA stands for. But you could argue that if all of Gottlieb's legacies, bringing LSD to the United States, was really the greatest one of all. Even Tim Leary
Yeah.
got to LSD indirectly through Gottlieb. His first idea of psychedelic, his first experience with psychedelics was magic mushrooms in Mexico. How did he find out that there was such a thing as magic mushrooms? It was because there was a big article in Life magazine about an expedition to Central America, to Mexico, where they found this Maria Sabina, this wise woman, and she gave them these mushrooms. The CIA was secretly sponsoring that expedition because Gottlieb wanted to find out about these mushrooms. And it was through that Tim Leary got into it. So the whole LSD culture in America, in a way, traces back to Gottlieb. Another interview that I found while I was researching Poisoner in Chief was an interview with John Lennon.
Yeah.
He was asked about LSD, and his answer was, we should always remember to thank the CIA. Now, he had never heard of Sidney Gottlieb. Nobody had. But if he had, he would have said, we must always remember to thank Sidney Gottlieb.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a massive part of his legacy. And you kind of sum up what Gottlieb's legacy was in a quote I've got here from your book. His life's work had been the search for exotic knowledge that could be used in service of covert action. So this sounds to me, again, this dichotomy of who this guy was, so strange in that, he's putting in all this work like this, and yet he seems to live a double life. I've read that, some people who live a double life are ill, psychopathic or something like that. Was there any evidence about Gottlieb's mental health?
I don't know of any, but I did get in contact with some people uh, who were in touch with him later in life, and they described him as having some oddities about him. Now, mental health, I don't know. That would be one of the questions I'd have to ask the kids that are not
Yeah.
speaking. But yeah, you do have to wonder, was he very conscious of the fact that he was living two lives, or did he somehow put them together and feel like, yes, they were a united whole? Now, one of the things that I speculate about at the end of the book, as to how such a humane and compassionate person could do such horrific things, is this. Maybe this is what Gottlieb's thought process could have been. I speculate. So he might have been thinking this. Here I am living a very unusual life. I don't want to live like other people. I want to live out in the country and milk my goats, and I'm offbeat. And I love America because America gave me the chance to do this. Now, America is facing a threat from a force that will, in the future, make it impossible for anybody to live an individual, meaningful life. We will all become mindless automatons of the Soviet system. That was the idea of what the alternative was to American prosperity. It's going to make it impossible for there ever to be a person like me. And therefore, in order to preserve the freedom of people to live and write poetry and have their wonderful families and be conscious of their environment and their spirituality, I need to do whatever is necessary to crush the force that wants to make that impossible. Go figure. Could that have been what he was thinking? That's one thought process by which perhaps he could justify to himself what he was doing at work in the name of protecting the kind of life that he lived at home.
Yeah, it's this Jekyll and Hyde story that as I was reading it, that was the thing that I kept picking at a little bit was how do you reconcile the two sides of this man?
Well, the difference, of course, between Jekyll and Hyde in this story is that Jekyll and Hyde were two different people. They assumed totally different personalities in one place and the other. With Gottlieb, I somehow speculate that he tried to put these together. Maybe taking acid 200 times was in part a way to try to find a way to deal with exactly
Yeah.
this conundrum.
Yeah.
How do I be those two people and how do I weave them together? Um, I'm sure that he must have discussed this with his wife at least. But I'm going to wait for some future playwright or screenwriter to come up with what those discussions might have been.
Yeah. So to talk about playwriting and screenwriting and that sort of thing a little bit. So Project Ultra, MK Ultra, eventually comes to an end, and Gottlieb eventually takes on a role as I think we mentioned earlier, sort of the Q from James Bond. He's making these Mission Impossible type gadgets. How does that go?
So Gottlieb was very, in many ways, a tinkerer. Don't forget that when he was making all the poisons, he was also making the devices that would deliver the
Yeah.
poison. Um, for example, the Soviet embassy in one South American country was bugged by the CIA, but the ambassador figured this out. And he started having his meetings outside the embassy in a larger compound under a tree. So Gottlieb, at the request of the local CIA station, concocted an arrow that could be shot, a miniature arrow that could be shot from a kind of a specially designed pistol that would shoot directly into that tree. And then it would have there a microphone and a transmitter so they could listen to the guy under the tree. So this was an example of many, many devices that he came up with that were mission specific. He would be working with an individual agent. And you used the phrase Mission Impossible. This was also a period of the 1960s when there were a lot of spy shows on TV. And it actually, talk about the overlap of fiction and reality, it actually produced a syndrome where on Monday mornings, it was regular at the CIA. They'd get calls from their stations from people who had seen a device on one of those TV shows and said, I'd like to have that in real life. Can you make one? So, yeah, Gottlieb graduated from making the devices to deliver poisons to making devices to deliver whatever anybody in the CIA wanted.
Yeah. Have you seen the new Mission Impossible movie? One that came
Yeah.
out last week. What'd you think?
Well, sometimes I think we're paying so much attention to the fantasy idea of what might be possible and how extreme things could get that we overlook the reality, the real stories. I mean, frankly, I'm prejudiced, of course, but I'd love to see a movie about MK Ultra
Yeah.
because that's not just the product of a screenwriter's fantasy. It's the real thing. As I said, this book is wild and there's so many stories that are practically unbelievable. But in that book, Poisoner in Chief, like in all my books, my favorite chapter is the footnotes. Everything in my book, it's a fact. I don't speculate. I don't. I speculate at home, but in my books, everything is factual, and there is so much in there that exceeds what a screenwriter could come up with. That I'm waiting for. I actually, the New Yorker book review of that book, Poisoner in Chief, said it was a film waiting to be made, and it suggested Pulp Fiction director would be the one to do it. Uh,
Oh,
so
and it's got to be that bizarre.
really, the characters are so crazy, and the violence is so mindless.
Yeah.
Uh, but I do think that it's interesting that fiction helped create the reality of MK Ultra in the sense that I spoke about earlier, that it created this mental background that these things were possible. But then at the other end, MK Ultra began to influence fiction. A lot of stories and a lot of movies were made. Suddenly, there you start hearing references to MK Ultra or mind control projects. Didn't you? There's a lot of movies now and TV shows and games. The cannabis cup for the best pot in the world. It's held in Amsterdam. And a few years ago, the winning strain, the most potent or best pot in the world, it's called MK Ultra. So that phrase has now entered into kind of the popular vernacular. And so a project that was in part the result of fiction has in the end come up affecting fiction.
Yeah, it's this circle, it seems, where maybe the CIA was influenced by the stories that had been coming up, and then they run this project, and now that project influences future stories. You mentioned in your book, The Men in Black, and that Mel Gibson movie, Conspiracy, and so many of them. So I wonder, how far has the world come with mind control?
Uh, I'm not the world's greatest expert on mind control. I'm an amateur because I had to learn about it writing this book. But I'd make this observation. Uh, Towards the end of the 1950s, people at this top level of the CIA became more aware of what Gottlieb was doing. Essentially, he was torturing people to death. And the project seemed crazier and crazier. And maybe there was a sense that the CIA had gone a little too far, and maybe this mind control thing was not something they should put a lot of emphasis on. Gottlieb, in his very Zen way, did not resist this attempt to slap down or limit his bureaucratic empire. On the contrary, he embraced it and went further. He said, not only should we reduce the scope of MK Ultra, we should just abolish it. We shouldn't do this anymore. You're all right. And actually, we have a memo in which he effectively says, my conclusion is there's no such thing as mind control. You can't do it. It's too, for example, LSD, too unpredictable. That there's no way that you can actually make a person do something like commit a murder that he's fundamentally opposed to doing. Okay, so there we are. Gottlieb, maybe the person who had experimented more deeply in this field than any living human in history, comes to a conclusion, which I think makes a lot of sense. You can't make a person do that. However, that was true when he wrote that memo, maybe. That was around 1960. Think of everything that has happened since then in cyber technology, neuroscience, artificial intelligence. So what may have been true then, there's no such thing as mind control. You can't take control of another person's mind. Might not be true anymore. And if there's nobody at the CIA or the Chinese or Russian counterparts or French or British who's researching this, I'll be very surprised. Uh, so mind control, as Gottlieb was searching for it, doesn't exist. It's a myth. But now we're in such a new era that it would just be logical to assume that there are people in secret services who are making the same calculation that the CIA officers were making in 1950, which is if you can do this, you can run the world. And now we have new tools. So let's see if we can. Um, I wouldn't be surprised if there's another Stephen Kinzer in 50 years who's writing another Poisoner in Chief 2, the sequel, about things that are happening right now that are as secret as MK Ultra was when it was happening in the 1950s.
Yeah, I think things seem so similar now in sort of the rhetoric that I hear about artificial intelligence, competition with China, even that Mission Impossible movie that we just discussed. The whole premise is that there's some sort of master AI that's going to control people's minds and destroy the world. And there's an arms race to try and get ahead of it. Is that what you think a modern day MK Ultra would look like?
I think there could be systems in which people's consciousness could be affected or shaped from outside.
Hmm.
Um, the beginning, we're just really at the primitive stone age of artificial intelligence right now. It's multiplying so fast. Actually, I'm terrified. I can see they're going to get so much smarter than we are. And they're going to realize, I think, sometimes I argue about this, not everyone believes it, but that finally there's going to be some point at which AI gets to a point of thinking, why do we need these human beings? They're such idiots. And instead of having the alien invasion that we used to fear back in past decades, maybe the aliens will come right from within our devices.
Maybe. Well, Stephen Kinzer, before I ask my last question, where should people look for you online?
So I have my own website, stephenkinzer.com, and there I have my stuff for my book, but also I write a column for the Boston Globe about world affairs, so you can find my stuff there. And all of my books are on Amazon, so please find them there and then go to your local independent bookstore and buy them.
All right. And Stephen, my final question is, what lessons, if any, do you think we should take from MK Ultra and the work of Sidney Gottlieb?
First of all, I think the lesson is not to get carried away with what some psychologists call presentism, that the present moment is so urgent that we have to get rid of all of the controls and the social and moral legal barriers that we normally observe. Um, you know, I lived in Turkey as the New York Times bureau chief for some years, and I came home thinking that the Turks actually were in one way, very immature because in dealing with the Kurds, their line was, "We want to respect human rights, but the Kurds are threatening our very existence as a nation, so we can't afford to observe human rights." And I used to think to myself, they're so backward. They don't understand. It's when you're under stress that you really have to observe human rights. They're so childish, these Turks. I was just arriving home and 9/11 was happening. Then the same thing happened here. There was such a frenzy. And the people said, well, oh, we can't observe those limitations on human rights. We're Americans. We always support human rights, but we can't do it now because we're in a real urgent situation. Part of the lesson of Gottlieb is don't fall for that.
Mm.
One of the greatest motivations to commit immoral acts is commitment to a great cause. Patriotism is one of the most seductive causes of all. So I think another part of the lesson is don't allow your devotion to abstractions like that allow you to lose your moral sense of your effect on ordinary human beings.
Well, Stephen, thank you for sharing those lessons, for taking a story that has been kind of pulled apart by culture for a long time and really doing great, thorough journalistic work and writing a book about it, and for taking this interview with me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
It's been great. Thank you.